Bristol Copwatch team for having me. I hope everyone's well. Yeah, first of all, I just want to say it's really inspiring to see this turnout, and it's really inspiring to be part of this conversation. We're trying to set something similar up in the West Midlands, and as you can imagine, it's just a very challenging project, isn't it, to set this kind of thing up and to Copwatch, but it's great to see that in Bristol it's taking off. So as has been so kindly already said by John, my name is Siana Bangura, and I am a writer, producer, and many other things, basically community organiser and the founder of Courageous Films. And I thought I'd start first of all by telling you a little bit about, I guess, how I got into this work and the documentary 1,500 and Counting, 1,500 and Counting. So I am the producer of that documentary, and I created it, made it with my friend and colleague, director Troy James. And we really embarked on this project, gosh, it feels like many, many years ago now. So about, well, May 2015. And I think the first thing to note is obviously us in the room, I'm sure, are on the same page with the fact that we have a police brutality crisis in this country. And I think we also would recognise the fact that we have been taught and given this lie that actually this is an American problem. This isn't something that happens in the UK. This isn't something that, you know, we need to kind of care about. Why are we kind of, you know, adopting the kind of narratives of the US, right? And that's a narrative that has been, you know, something fed to us and lies that were fed to us for a long time. So I would say that although, you know, kind of baby me was definitely very kind of aware of a lot of the kind of injustices, even I, to an extent, wasn't so aware of the extent of the kind of prison industrial complex in this country, the issue of police brutality right on our kind of home terrain. And so this came into sharp focus for me in 2015 after the murder of Sheku Bayo. So if we were in the same room, I would just literally ask you to raise your hand if you've heard of his name, but because we're on Zoom, I'd just be a bit long to try and like get your hands up. But I'm gonna hope that some of you have heard of him, but I also imagine many of you haven't. So Sheku Bayo it's tragic that I have to use past tense for him, but he was someone who was Syrian British, and he lived in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. So that's also really important to note, because a lot of the time we don't even, and actually a lot of the stats that I'm sure we'll all talk about, they often refer to England and Wales, and I'm always thinking, but what about Scotland, right? Some of the research that I've come across over the years, don't take my complete word for it, but I think some of the research really just kind of quotes that the numbers are negligible, which is why, for lots of reasons, we don't even kind of have anything beyond England and Wales. And I think that is also something to be looked at, how these numbers are put together. But in any case, so Sheku Bayo's case really was a huge thing in Scotland. But at the time, so I really came across his story literally in this way. So as I said, Sheku was of Syrian descent, and that is my heritage as well. And it really was a case of I was on Twitter, and I just kind of like noticed his name trending a little bit, actually. Well, not trending, but like his name was on Twitter. And just out of curiosity, I kind of looked and I was thinking, oh, who's this person, da da da. And I quickly learned that he'd been killed by police. And I immediately thought, okay, this is something that's happened in the States, da da da. So I kept on doing my research and found out that he was killed by police in Scotland, in Kirkcaldy. And I was just horrified and shocked and kind of like, why are we not talking about this? Because at the same time, I was busy, you know, we were busy organising around kind of the murders of Eric Garner and people like that in the US, names that we would have been familiar with. And later on, of course, like the Sandra Bland's, and we were shutting down Westfield and doing die-ins and all these kinds of things for people across the pond, as we should, but we were not even really speaking Sheku's name out loud. And so I really was just trying to process this, and I was talking to Troy a lot. And previously, Troy and I had been working together on like creative projects, because I'm an artist as well. And we both were kind of like, what can we do? And only thing, you know, I kind of was like, well, maybe if there's others like us who, you know, aren't really aware of what's going on, then, you know, we should make a film. And the rest is history, really. So we ended up embarking on this project, definitely naively, but embarked on this project, ended up partnering up and doing a lot of work with the United Families and Friends campaign, an organisation I hope some of you, if not many of you, have heard of. And you know, we worked with Inquest, Institute of Race Relations, mainly, you know, their research has been foundational, particularly Institute of Race Relations is powerful report, Dying for Justice, is something that I encourage you all to look at. It's old now, but it's and that's where kind of the 1,500 number came from, that research. In any case, so we partnered up and then started making this film, and really then the following year, at the start of 2016, then we had the tragic death of Sarah Reid. So again, I'm hoping that people have heard of Sarah Reid. So she really was let down by every facet of the state apparatus, right? So from police, from mental health institutions, from hospitals, and so on and so forth. And her story is another story that we zone in on in the film, particularly the kind of looking at actually something that isn't really looked at enough is the effects of policing on women, right, on Black women in this country. Sarah being somebody who was, one thing that does come up a lot as well is the mental health crisis in this, because oftentimes people who are having a mental health crisis end up having the police called on them rather than the care that they need, right? And they end up dead. So Sarah was indeed someone who ended up developing serious mental health problems after a lot of trauma, basically. So I urge you to kind of look up her story. So really, it was those two deaths in particular that kind of propelled us to kind of finish the film. And you know, it's been a journey along the way. We've worked closely as well with Janet Alder, who is the sister of Christopher Alder. So again, a name that a lot of people should know. His case is one of, I mean, all of these cases are horrific, but his case is something from a horror movie, quite frankly, and really shows you the kind of the extent of police cruelty, the extent of the cover-up, the extent of how far these things can go. And actually there's a play at the moment called Typical, which you might want to, starring Richard Blackwood, which is something you might want to look up. And I think you can, for a limited time, kind of download it, buy a subscription and download it and watch it, obviously, because we're online at the moment, even theatre. And it tells you, it gives you a little insight, a creative insight, or creatively adapted insight into what happened to Christopher, basically. So those kind of are the kind of key cases in the film. And I just think along the journey, really, it's been something that has opened our eyes to the fact that actually it's not something new. And the resistance also is not something new. You know, for over 20 years, the United Families and Friends campaign have been calling for justice, basically, and still there is no justice. So I wanted just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of the film. And at the time of making the film, like I said, the numbers were roughly 1,500, give or take, deaths in custody or directly following police contact since 1990, with 0 convictions. And now if we fast forward to 2021, we have about 1,777 deaths. I think we're even leaning towards 1,800 and still 0 convictions. And a number of these deaths are Black and brown people who have died because of disproportionate use of force against them. And I think this is something that we should all be greatly concerned about, right? This is work that in the Institute of Race Relations and Inquest have kind of done a lot of stuff around, and the Forefront Project. And another kind of thing to highlight for you is the fact that actually 28% of young people in custody in England and Wales are Black, as per stats through to March 2019. So again, all of these things are speaking to a pattern, and it's not surprising, in all honesty. I think if you are surprised by this and you've really not been paying attention, haven't been awake, those of us who have been doing this work and have lived experience are not surprised by this, right? But we understand that we're dealing with more than just kind of like 1 or 2 rotten apples, which is often what you're told about the police, and we're dealing with a rotten cart and institutionally racist kind of system. And so, because we're talking about the pandemic context as well in this conversation, I thought it was useful just to also raise the fact that, you know, we've all been affected by this pandemic, but the effects have not been equal, quite frankly. And I don't know if people remember the narratives at the start of everything. It feels like it's been going on forever, so we might have forgotten the start of it all, but it was kind of like, this is the great equalizer for whom? It's not at all. And I think what the pandemic has done is exasperated the injustices we already had and the inequities that already existed, right? And actually just highlighted them further and made the gulf even bigger between the haves and the have-nots. So in terms of the pandemic, even, you know, statistics from the Office of National Statistics reminded us that Black women, so defined as Black Afro-Caribbean or Black other, were 4.3 times more likely to die from COVID-19, more than white women, and Black men were 4.2 times more likely to die. And overall, the Black community was twice as likely to die from the pandemic than white communities. And, you know, this is not because of some kind of like predisposition to the effects of COVID. It's literally because of socio-economic circumstance, right? If you have to go to work despite a pandemic, then you're going to have to go to work, right? If you're working in the jobs that mean you're on the front line without PPE, then you're going to be more predisposed then to dying from something like COVID, right? And all the other things that come around it. And I think that, you know, it's very important to note that disadvantage literally kills. And this is something that we've seen still go unaddressed actually during this pandemic. And these numbers, you know, aren't just numbers, these are lives, right? For every number, this is a story, this is somebody, this is a family that's lost somebody. And I think often when we start talking about statistics, we kind of get a bit removed and bogged down by them, but we've got to remember that we're talking about people's lives. And I think it's also really important to note that when we think about policing in the pandemic, that the very first person to actually be arrested under the coronavirus bill, if you will remember that, which was rushed through Parliament, obviously, and kind of done in you know, in the midst of chaos, right, was indeed a Black woman, and her arrest was described as shambolic, because of course it was shambolic, quite frankly. And if we want to just really remind ourselves of the history of policing, it's important to note that policing and the police are mired in colonialism, right? So this is a colonial project that is still something that we are enduring in 2021. The police themselves were founded really as a direct response to insurrections, right? They were founded they were created in order to quell political dissent, to protect property, and that property included people. So again, the police have never been and will never be for Black people, brown people, and the working classes. And I wanted to highlight a report. So many of you would have heard of Netpol. I know people from Copwatch as well here have worked with them closely, and they actually released a fantastic report, I believe towards the end of last year or the start of this year. And they worked with it. It was actually written by Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper. And I just wanted to kind of note a few things from that, particularly looking at the policing of the BLM protests. So they found, unsurprisingly, that there was excessive use of force used against protesters, particularly the Black protesters at a BLM protest about police brutality. Kettling was used as a violent tactic, something that anyone who's ever been to a protest knows all too well, basically holding people hostage, including children and the potentially vulnerable, in confined spaces for up to 8 hours, right? With making social distancing impossible, no access to food, no access to water, not able to go to the toilet, all of that kind of level of neglect. And actually the neglect of BLM protesters went even further. So whilst at the same time, there were these counter demos, right? Really just fascists and Nazis trying to sort of swing their weight around a little bit. The police actually didn't do very much. And in fact, there were instances of encouraging their actions against BLM protesters. And so when BLM protesters would go and need help, they'd actually just be further criminalized, right? We heard cases of horses being charged at crowds and people being harmed in disgusting ways. And so you have to ask yourself, why? In a global pandemic, right, would hundreds of thousands of protesters, many being Black, come out to protest racism, right? Well, at the end of the day, it's because regardless, we have endured pandemics, right? The pandemic of racism. And the difference is the pandemic of racism is something that people have often ignored for a very long time, white people in particular. It has been allowed to go unabated and just be the problem basically of Black and brown people and global majority peoples. And only now, and in light of kind of the death of, or the killing of George Floyd, we see people waking up. Although I would argue that we've also seen people go back to sleep now that the Black squares on Instagram have disappeared and so on and so forth. But we have to ask ourselves, why would people go on these kind of protests if they didn't feel they had to? Because it is a life or death matter, basically. We have to also remember that even just thinking about the militarization of police, which is important to note. We have in the US, for example, the riot shields, all the anti-protest equipment, CS gas, all the things that were used against rioters were often actually provided by the UK. And this is some research that so my other organisation is Campaign Against Arms Trade, and we did research into this and found that, and we actually also found that, if you folks remember the End SARS protests, so the protests led by amazing young Nigerians in Nigeria, some of them losing their lives actually off the back of this. Again, the UK was behind training of that unit. So the UK is always there when it comes to wickedness, basically, and exporting violence and racism across the world. And actually, just before I close up and carry on, I wanted just to make sure that I shout out the work of the Black Protest Legal Support Group, the United Families and Friends Campaign, Green and Black Cross, Forefront, Netpol, Adam Elliott Cooper, the Institute of Race Relations, and of course, Copwatch collectives like this, because it's important to note that whilst this is all happening, we have resistance along the way, right? And we've always had resistance. The title of this event is justice is justice nowhere. And indeed, there is justice nowhere. You know, even after the uprisings that we saw, we still have heard now this year of the deaths of people like Mohammed Hassan in Cardiff and Moyed Bashir in Gwent. And I think it's really important to note that you can have a massive uprising after the death of George Floyd and still here we are having these kind of conversations. And, you know, these names that I've just given you, they join the list of historic names, right? And not even that historic, but names like Chekuboya, like I said, Kevin Clark, Leon Briggs, Rashawn Charles, Sean Rigg, Christopher Alder, Cherry Gross, Joy Gardner. The list is long and it is damning. And so if we ask ourselves what needs to be done, well, first and foremost, I always say when I get asked to speak about these things, it's incredibly, incredibly important that we actually recognise that the conversation that we're having around abolition is one that should be taken incredibly seriously. This is not a concept that is just coming from the US, right? It's not something that is like unrealistic and willy-nilly. We have to understand that we need radical transformation. As I said before, we can't reform the police because it was always mired in colonialism and never created to protect Black and brown people in the working classes. So you can't reform something like that. And so we have to think about radical new alternatives. And actually, if you really think about it, asking for justice is not radical at all, right? It's basic, but here we are nonetheless. I also wanted just to flag, this is something that I just saw yesterday evening. So figures that came out at the start of March, the start of this month, and we are still at the start of this month, 97% of police who are accused of racism face no action. And I think I want to point out that it's really interesting that I came across this on Instagram, but it was a snippet from the Daily Mirror. So we're talking about a trash paper that is very right-wing, also had to acknowledge the fact that it was disgusting that 97% of police who are accused of racism face no action. There's a real irony in there. The police are indeed above the law, and that can't be safe for anybody. And so I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but towards the end of last year in the summer, we toured 1,500 and counting. We were meant to have a real life tour, but obviously because of Rona, we had to adapt our plans. And so we ended up hosting a number of community roundtables as well as alongside the screenings. And actually one of them was in partnership with Arnold Feeney in your beloved Bristol. And I wanted just to share a few words from some of our community at those roundtables. So one thing that one of our speakers, Afua Hirsch, reminded us is that we can only change things with the disinfectant of sunlight. And I wanted to end on something that an attendee told us. So they said, hopelessness is valid and understandable, but change and social justice exist on many terrains. And so I guess I wanted just to share that with you to note that this feels like a massive task. And when we talk about abolition, when we talk about change, we're not talking about stuff that can just be done overnight, right? We are talking about incremental change. Some of these changes we may not actually see in our lifetimes, but it's important that we start doing that work. And some people have been doing the work, many people in this room, but it's important that we understand we must have stamina, that this is a marathon and not a race, and that we have to be looking at some seriously radical solutions because we simply cannot reform the police. Thank you, everybody.